Hi guys, so if you like to use a table saw in your workshop, what you've probably noticed is that the miter gauge that comes with your table saw is probably a little bit substandard to say the least. So the miter gauge that came with my table saw, you can see it's not very big, so it doesn't give very much support to the workpiece. It's also a little bit loose, a little bit wiggly, which again doesn't give much stability, and also it takes away the accuracy of your cut as well. So when I want to cut at 90 degrees, I've actually got my miter gauge set up at 3 degrees, so that again the gauge when you're cutting angles is really inaccurate as well. And I think this is quite a common problem with the miter gauges that come with table saws. They seem to be quite rubbish, shall we say. So I've seen a lot of sort of aftermarket miter gauges online. So you can get quite fancy ones with, extensions and stop blocks and all that sort of stuff, which is good. Unfortunately, the tracks in my table saw are not industry standard size, so it's really difficult for me to actually find an aftermarket miter gauge that fits my table saw. I couldn't find one at all. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to try and build a cross-cut sled. And hopefully, by building the cross-cut sled, that's going to solve all the problems I have with this miter gauge. With a cross-cut sled, it's going to give me consistent, accurate 90-degree cuts. It's also going to give me a lot more stability on my workpiece because we're going to have a much longer fence. And also it will give me the ability to clamp a stop block to it as well if I'm wanting to do multiple cuts of the same length. So hopefully if we build a cross-cut sled, then that's going to solve most of the problems I have with this miter gauge. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is to cut some of this 5mm plywood that I've got for the runners. So I'm going to cut two pieces which are the exact size to fit into these two tracks here. And that's what the sled is going to slide through. Now, the size of my tracks is exactly half an inch. So again, like I said before, it's not industry standard, this table saw. So what I need to do is cut two strips of this 5mm ply at exactly half an inch. Now it's really important if you're making a cross-cut sled to get these runners absolutely perfect size. If they're too loose, you'll find that your cross-cut sled will wobble around. If they're too tight, then you'll find that it's not going to slide through across your table nicely. So it's really important to take a bit of time to get these runners the exact size. Okay, so what I have here, I'm lucky that I've been able to find a little piece of 1/2 inch. It's mild steel box section, which is 1/2 inch all the way round. So if we put that in the track, you see that slides really nicely. There's no wiggle room in that. That's a perfect fit, that 1/2 inch. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to use this 1/2 inch mild steel box section to set up the position of my rip fence, and that should help me get exact 1/2 inch cuts on this ply. Excellent. Okay, that's perfect. Really happy with those two runners now. They're the exact size that we're going to need. So once you've got your runners cut out and you're happy with the accuracy of them, the next thing you want to do is to get a bit which is going to form the top of your sled. So I've used 18mm ply for this, and I've cut it out. It really just depends on what size of sled you want or how big your table saw is. So the width of mine is 76 centimetres and the depth is 50 centimetres. So that's going to form the top part of the cross-cut sled. Also, another cut you need to make, again I'm going to use 18mm ply for this, is to cut the parts that are going to form your front and your back fences. So I'm going to have my front and back fences about 8 centimetres high, I think. And what I'm going to do is use the 18mm ply again, but I'm going to double them up. So I'm going to cut 4 pieces, 2 of which will form the top fence and 2 of which will form the back fence. Okay, so that's all the main components of our crosscut sled cut now, so I'm just going to start a bit of assembly. So what I'm going to do first of all, those last bits that we cut for the front and back fences, first thing I'm going to do is glue and clamp them together. They'll also be reinforced with screws as well. Okay, so with a good layer of glue on each of these, we're just going to turn that over and place it up against the other one, and the same. So these 2 bits are going to form the front and back fences. They'll just get glued together initially. So I'll just square them up, make sure they're nice and level with each other. Okay, that looks good. And what I'm going to do is just clamp them together for just now and then leave that to dry overnight. Okay, so that's our front and back fences clamped and glued together, so I'm just going to leave them overnight to dry. Okay, so the next step, what we want to do is attach the runners that we cut earlier on to the top part of our sled. So when we stick the runners in here, we want them to be sitting proud of the top of the table saw, so that when we drop the top of the sled on, it's going to sit kind of flush on these runners. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I've got some little nuts here, I'm going to drop them down into the tracks, so that when I put my runners in, they will sit on top of the runners, and then they will push the runners up slightly proud of the top of the table saw. So if I put 4 nuts down in each track, that should work perfect. Okay, so you can see now when we drop the runners into the tracks, that's sitting exactly where we want them, so we know that they're going to be in the exact position and exactly straight when they get attached onto the top of the sled. Okay, so that's them in a good position now, happy with that. So what I'm going to do, we're going to glue this onto the sled initially, but again we will reinforce with screws once it dries. What I'm going to do though is, when I put glue on these runners, I don't want the glue to seep out onto my table saw, so I'm going to put a couple of lines of masking tape down the side of each runner. Okay, so with glue applied evenly and spread evenly over both runners, what we're going to do now is take our top piece, and we are going to sit that on top of the runners. I'm going to try and square it up with the bottom edge of my table saw. Okay, and that looks good. Right, so obviously when the top of our sled is in this position, it's pretty much impossible for us to clamp it in place. So what I'm going to do is just put some weight on there to allow the glue to dry. Okay, so that's me just put a bit of weight on top of that. That'll just apply a bit of pressure until that glue dries between the runners and the top of our sled here. We've got our front and back fences glued up and clamped as well. So all I'm just going to do is leave that overnight, and we'll come back and finish it off tomorrow. So that's all our glued up pieces dry now. So you can see with the runners are secured on the back there in place. So when we drop that onto the table saw, that fits in perfectly into the tracks, and that glides nicely across the top of the table saw. So you can see the runners were just a little bit too long for the top of my sled, so I'm just now going to trim them off so they're flush with the top edge of the sled. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is flip the sled over, and what we're going to do is put 4 screws in each runner just to reinforce them. I'm going to drill pilot holes but countersink the holes as well, so that the screws are sitting just beneath the surface of these runners. Okay, so that's our runners all secured down, exactly in place, so that should slot nicely into the tracks and slide easily over the top of our table saw. So that's looking good. So the next stage, so we're going to take the front and back fences that we glued together last night. You can see these are a bit longer than the sled, so what I'm going to do first of all is just trim these down to size. So now that I've trimmed these down to the same width as the top of our sled, I'm just going to reinforce these with screws again. So 4 in each, and again I'm going to drill the pilot holes and countersink them as well. So that's the front and back fences finished now and all secured. So we're now going to attach them to the top of the sled. Okay, so if we put the sled onto the table saw, we're going to have one fence at the front here, and we're going to have one fence towards the back here. So we're going to deal with this top fence first. So we'll put that to one side. So the position of the top fence isn't massively important. It doesn't have to be exactly 90 degrees to your blade. So all I'm going to do with the top fence is just kind of square it up with the edge of the top of the sled, and we're going to glue and screw that into position. Okay, so that's our top fence now secured into position. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to raise the blade of my table saw up, and we're just going to do a partial cut through, about halfway through the top of the sled. Okay, so with our top fence on and we've got a partial cut through the sled, it's now time to fit the bottom fence. So the position of the bottom fence is so important when you're making a cross-cut sled. If this is not set up at the correct angle, then you're not going to get accurate 90-degree cuts. So it's worth taking your time at this stage to double, triple check that this back fence is exactly 90 degrees to your blade. So what I'm going to do to start with is I will put one screw from underneath through into the bottom fence here, and with one screw holding it in place, that'll allow me to adjust, kind of use that screw as a pivot to adjust the position of this until I'm happy that it's exactly 90 degrees to the blade. So now with that one screw holding the back fence here in place, you can see that allows me to change the angle of it, so I now can set it up exactly 90 degrees to my blade. So what I'm going to do first is raise the blade back up. I'm going to raise the blade quite high, Okay, and then what we're going to need is a square so that we can accurately measure this 90-degree angle. So if we can use a square against the fence and then rest it against the blade, that will tell us whether the blade is sitting at 90 degrees to the fence. So I'm a little bit out here, so what I can do is just adjust with that pivot screw. That is easily able to adjust the position of this fence, and that looks good there. So what I'm going to do, obviously as I said, this is so important, I'm going to double check it, triple check it before we put any more screws in to hold it in place. That looks good on that side, and again just double check this side again. Okay, so I'm happy with that now. Excellent. Okay, so that's looking good. So that's the exact position I want this fence. That's going to give us exact 90-degree cuts. Now I'm not going to glue this fence in place just in case that it needs adjustment at a later date. I'm just going to hold this in place with some screws. So obviously this side has already got one screw in it. I'm going to first of all put the saw blade back down, and then I'm just going to gently slide the sled back towards me just enough that I can get a clamp in this end just to hold it exactly in place. So then we should be able to get a clamp in that end to hold that end in place. That's held it in at the exact 90-degree angle that we want, and then again I'm just going to slip underneath now and finish off by putting the screws underneath. Okay, so that's our bottom fence attached securely in the exact correct position. So all I'm going to do now is just complete this cut so it just comes out slightly behind the back of this the bottom fence. So you can see I've left a bit of a gap here at the back of my fence, at the back of the sled behind the bottom fence, and the reason for that is to apply a little bit of a safety feature. As you can see, the blade kind of comes through the back here and sticks up, so we really don't want our fingers to be getting caught in there. So the reason I've left this gap is so that I can attach a piece of wood in here, so the blade kind of gets buried in that wood, and it also acts as a little bit of a reminder to keep your fingers well out of the way of the centre of that board where the blade's going to come through. So all I'm going to do now is attach this safety feature onto the bottom of the sled and also a couple of screws through into that back fence. So that is the construction of our crosscut sled finished now. Just one little finishing touch to do is I'm going to sand and wax the bottom of it just to make sure that it slides and glides across the table saw nice and easily. And that's our crosscut sled now finished and ready to use. You can see that's given us consistent, accurate 90-degree cuts every single time. What we can also do, another benefit of the crosscut sled, is if you want to do multiple cuts of the same size, we can just set up a stop block against the bottom fence here, and that will give us exact same size cuts on every pass. Perfect. So thanks very much for joining me on this video of the construction of my crosscut sled. Don't forget to click like and share it with your friends, and also please subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Thanks for watching.